Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme, and some say, well, it's just a mess, basically, with three likely ways forward, each of them just as problematic as the last. After more than 2 years of tough negotiations with Europe, what now for the UK and Brexit? Well, it can either leave the EU with no deal, seen by many as economic suicide. It can leave the EU with Prime Minister Theresa May's deal, seen by many as unacceptable and not really leaving the EU anyway. Or, of course, will turn the whole thing on its head and stay after all. All three scenarios setting off potentially a whole new range of spin-off problems. Complicated? Well, it couldn't be much more so, could it? Let's speak now on the programme to Paul McGrade. He's worked at the British Foreign Office, the European Commission in Brussels and the Cabinet Office as an advisor on EU treaty negotiations. Now provides senior counsel at Lexington Communications. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. I mean, just slightly whimsical introduction there, I suppose, but let's face it, all three of these scenarios are a total mess, aren't they?
All three are pretty difficult, and I think what you're seeing now in Parliament is if you like, the clash of two different processes. We've already had the international negotiation process, which is done by the government with the EU. That's concluded, and we have a deal. Now what we're seeing is, if you like, MPs, parliamentarians catching up with that and trying to reconcile the pretty limited choices that you've set out with what they originally hoped for from Brexit, which in a lot of cases looks very different. So they've got to go on the same journey that Theresa May and the government have been on, but in a matter of days and weeks rather than more than a year that it took the government to get to this point of thinking this is the best deal available.
Just seeing, in fact, some information coming down to us. The British Finance Minister's been speaking on UK radio, speaking ahead of a government report due to come out today on the economic impacts of various Brexit scenarios. He obviously saying the Prime Minister Theresa May's deal is the best deal. Do you see it like that?
Well, I think a lot of EU member states feel that the UK's got a much better deal than they expected out of this. The UK's always made it a priority to end free movement of people from EU into the UK. They've secured that, and they've also secured a path potentially to not quite frictionless trade in the future, but certainly lower friction trade than most third countries have with the EU. And I think you've seen a bit of a pushback from Paris, from Madrid, and from other member states just in the final stages of this deal. So I think from one perspective on the EU side, this is a pretty good deal from the UK. And I think part of the problem in terms of the Westminster arithmetic of getting this deal through is that lots of MPs here start from a very different perspective. And as I say, they've got to go on the same journey that the government did to come to a view about what is actually negotiable.
Do you think Theresa May could pull this off? I mean, she's got little more than a week now, hasn't she?
Well, the markets don't think so. So when you look at what the markets are saying and what the bookmakers are saying at the kind of street level of the markets, everyone's expecting that she'll lose that first vote on the 11th of December. I think it's penciled in for about 7 p.m. So a night of drama where everyone's expecting, potentially quite heavy defeat for the government on that. But the markets expect that the deal will be passed at a second, or if necessary, a third time of asking. And I think there's an element of phony war about this. The vote on the 11th of December has pretty much become a free vote in UK parliamentary terms because everyone's expecting the government to be defeated. It's what happens afterwards where the fun really starts.
And Paul, I know you've written a piece recently saying that you think a no-deal Brexit will not be the end of negotiations if that were to occur. Why do you say that?
So I think there's a misconception about no deal in a lot of the UK debate. No deal isn't an endpoint because it's not really sustainable for an economy like the UK that's so integrated with the rest of Europe, and particularly because of the geography of the pinch point around the narrow straits, Calais and Dover, and how much
that's not how the hard Brexiters see it, though, is it?
No, sure, there are a small number, I would say, of MPs who actively want a no deal because that burns those bridges and it makes a close tie-up between the UK and the EU in future very, very unlikely, at least for many years. But I think there's an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians who want to avoid no deal because they see a lot of those risks. The problem is it's not what you want, it's what you choose. If Parliament wants to avoid a no deal, they've got to choose another option and actively vote for that in a motion and then in a bill before the 29th of March. And that means Theresa May's deal or remain effectively via another referendum.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that other option. I mean, do you think there's any chance, realistically, that the UK could remain in Europe?
So I think it's pretty unlikely. It feels like the least likely option at the moment. But I think it's important, through all the kind of noise and technical confusion about what's going to happen over the next few months, to keep in mind that there's actually a pretty simple game going on here, and it's a game of chicken, where the proponents of each of the different outcomes, the small minority who want no deal, the government who want Theresa May's deal, the people who want another referendum, are basically trying to wait until the last possible moment when they hope that Parliament will have to go for their preferred option because everything else has been voted down. So amid all the noise, there's actually a pretty crude game of chicken going on here for people to get their preferred outcome.
And finally, Paul, I mean, there's also been a lot of criticism in the UK, hasn't there, of Europe, saying it's kind of Europe's fault because they're putting too much pressure and being too tough on the UK in these negotiations. Is that fair? Is there some argument for that?
Well, I think this is just a reality of international negotiations. When you're a third country, the UK is finding out just how different and difficult it is to be outside the fence, even if you're pretty close to the EU, rather than being right up against the fence on the other side from the inside. It's one thing to negotiate opt-outs and special treatment, as the UK regularly and very successfully did as a member state. It's another thing on the way out to try and negotiate special treatment. But as I say, the UK did pretty well in these negotiations from an EU perspective. But when the narrative in the UK media, or much of it, is of hoping for a kind of impossible deal in the end, then you're going to see this this thread running of punishment, which is just not a very grown-up way of viewing international negotiations.
Paul, thanks very much for speaking to us today. Paul McGrade, he's worked at the British Foreign Office, European Commission and Brussels, and the Cabinet Office as an advisor on EU treaty negotiations. Thanks for joining us today from London.
Thank you.